I never imagined my own home would become a battleground, that my neighbors and I would be treated like criminals for simply existing. Fines, threats, harassment, all because of a corrupt HOA bent on squeezing us dry and forcing us out. They tasered my sister, broke into my house, and stole from hard-working families, all in the name of greed. Watching them laugh in our faces, knowing they held all the power. That was the moment I swore, I'd burn their empire to the ground. I never thought much about homeowner associations. Rules are rules, right? Keep your lawn neat, don't blast music at midnight, simple enough. That's what I assumed when I moved into Pinecrest Gardens, a pristine, cookie-cutter neighborhood with manicured lawns and matching mailboxes. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a quiet place to settle after years of city chaos. I had no idea I was walking into a battleground. My name is Alex Carter, and I learned the hard way that some people don't just enforce rules, they weaponize them. It started small, a $50 fine for guest parking. Annoying, but nothing worth fighting over. My sister, Emma, was staying with me while her new house was being renovated, so I shrugged it off. Then came another violation, improper trash bin placement. Then another, wind chimes deemed disruptive. By the end of the week, the fines totaled almost $500. Something felt off. My neighbors whispered about Diane Wilcox, the HOA president, who had turned the association into her personal dictatorship. I wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble had clearly found me. And when they came after my sister, they made the biggest mistake of their lives. The bright yellow paper stuck to my door flapped in the morning breeze, mocking me. Violation notice, unauthorized guest parking, $50 fine. I ripped it down, my jaw tightening. Emma had been parked in my driveway for 2 weeks, 2 damn weeks, while her new house was being painted. Not blocking the sidewalk, not on the street, just sitting in my own driveway. I crumpled the notice in my fist, tossing it onto the counter as I grabbed my coffee. Emma walked in, still in her pajamas, sipping from a mug that read "Do no harm, take no crap." "Another one?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yep. Parking this time." I huffed, rubbing the bridge of my nose. She smirked. I knew I should have parked on the HOA president's lawn. I chuckled, but the annoyance didn't fade. I'd lived in Pinecrest Gardens for 3 years without a single issue, and now, suddenly, I was drowning in fines. It wasn't just me, either. My neighbor Rob's kid got fined for leaving his bike in the driveway. Ellen across the street had a $200 violation for non-conforming flower pots. Something was off, and I didn't like it. Later that afternoon, I spotted Diane Wilcox standing on the sidewalk, her phone pointed directly at my house. She wasn't even trying to be subtle. Her perfectly ironed blazer didn't have a single wrinkle, and her sharp blue eyes held the kind of satisfaction that made my stomach churn. She caught me staring and smiled. She waved. The smugness of that wave sent my blood boiling. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind spun through every fine, every ridiculous rule violation stacked against me. What was their endgame? To annoy me into leaving? To make me submit? The next morning, I caught Thomas Harding, the HOA treasurer, sneaking onto my property with a tape measure. He crouched beside my trash bins, measuring the exact distance from my house. I threw open the door. "You want me to move them an inch, Thomas? Would that make you feel powerful?" He stumbled back, muttering something about standards. Frustration boiled into rage. This wasn't about rules. This was about control. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, flipping through the stack of violation notices that had accumulated over the past 2 weeks. Each one felt more absurd than the last. Unauthorized guest parking. Improper trash bin placement. Decorative wind chimes not in compliance. The sheer pettiness of it all made my skin crawl. Emma sat across from me, arms crossed, eyes flicking over the papers. This isn't random, she said. They're targeting you. I exhaled sharply. Yeah, but why? I've never had an issue before. Emma tapped a perfectly manicured nail against the table. Because you're not just anyone, Alex. You're the last person they need to push out. I frowned. What are you talking about? She grabbed her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard. I started looking into Pinecrest Gardens' recent home sales. Turns out, 6 houses in the neighborhood have been sold in the last 3 months, all to shell companies connected to Valley Development Group. My stomach dropped. The same company that built the new condos on Maple Drive? Emma nodded. And guess who sits on their advisory board? She spun the laptop around. A sleek corporate website filled the screen. Right there, under senior advisors, was a headshot of Diane Wilcox. That lying, I cut myself off, my hands curling into fists. She's been running a scam, Emma continued. Fining people into submission. Making it impossible for them to stay. And when they finally crack and sell, Valley Development swoops in and buys the house at a discount. A slow, ugly realization crawled up my spine. They're trying to push me out. Emma's eyes darkened. Not just you. Anyone they see as a roadblock. I sat back, rubbing a hand down my face. This wasn't just about overgrown grass or a guest parking violation. This was a coordinated attack. A shakedown disguised as community standards. And I had just become their next target. I met Emma's gaze, my anger settling into something colder. Sharper. They messed with the wrong house. I sat in my car, parked just down the street from the Pinecrest Gardens HOA office, my fingers drumming against the steering wheel. The fluorescent glow from inside the building flickered against the darkening sky, shadows moving behind the frosted windows. Something was happening in there. And I needed to know what. Emma had spent the afternoon digging through public records while I visited some neighbors, trying to gather more information. The stories were all the same: unfair violations, relentless fines, pressure to sell. But no one had any real proof that Diane was orchestrating it. Until Emma found the paper trail. The timing of the violations matches the home sales, she'd said earlier, spreading documents across my kitchen table. And look at this. She pointed to a permit request filed 6 months ago, before Diane even became HOA president. It was a zoning request. Commercial. The land our neighborhood sat on wasn't meant to stay residential. It was part of a much bigger plan. And if Diane and Valley Development got their way, Pinecrest Gardens would cease to exist. Now, parked outside the HOA office, I watched as a sleek black SUV pulled into the lot. My pulse quickened. The driver's side door swung open, and a tall man in a dark suit stepped out, his movements crisp, practiced. Then Diane appeared, marching out of the building like she owned the night. She shook the man's hand, laughing at something he said, and then handed him a thick folder. He flipped through the pages, nodding in approval before closing it and tucking it under his arm. I grabbed my phone and snapped a picture. A car pulled up behind me, its headlights flashing against my rearview mirror. My stomach dropped. Had they seen me? I held my breath, gripping the steering wheel as I watched the SUV reverse and glide out of the parking lot, disappearing into the night. I exhaled, heart hammering in my chest. Whatever was in that folder was important. And I had a feeling it was the key to blowing this entire scheme wide open. The next morning, I woke up to a loud thud against my front door. My stomach twisted as I walked over, half expecting another violation notice. But when I opened the door, I found something worse, a brick wrapped in a crumpled piece of paper. My pulse pounded as I unwrapped it, my hands shaking. Big mistake. Drop it. The words were scrawled across the page in thick, black ink. I stepped outside, scanning the street, but everything looked normal. The sun had barely risen, and a few neighbors were starting their morning routines, walking their dogs, sipping coffee on their porches. But no one looked my way. A cold wave of realization hit me. Someone was watching. I slammed the door shut and locked it. Emma was already awake, sitting at my kitchen table, reviewing the notes we had gathered. I tossed the brick onto the table, and she jerked back, eyes wide. They know we're onto them. She picked up the note, her jaw tightening. This is a scare tactic. It's working. I exhaled, running a hand through my hair. We need to move fast before they escalate. Emma nodded, already pulling up something on her laptop. I've been going through more of the HOA's financials. You were right, there's money missing. She turned the screen toward me. Tens of thousands of dollars in maintenance fees transferred to accounts linked to Valley Development. They've been funneling funds from the homeowners into their own pockets. I clenched my fists. So they're not just trying to buy people out, they're draining the community dry first. Emma sighed. We need more proof. We need someone on the inside. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. We see you. Walk away. I gritted my teeth. Emma, I said, locking eyes with her, I think it's time we take this to the next level. She nodded, determination flashing in her eyes. Then let's turn the tables. The moment the judge granted our emergency injunction, something shifted, not just in the courtroom, but in me. I had spent weeks being harassed, intimidated, and bullied, but now, for the first time, I wasn't just fighting back, I was winning. Diane sat across the room, her usually smug expression cracked at the edges. She clenched her jaw as the judge's voice rang out. Until a full investigation is completed, all HOA fines, enforcement actions, and property sales related to Valley Development are hereby frozen. The gavel hit the desk, and I exhaled. The weight that had been pressing against my chest for weeks felt lighter. Outside the courthouse, neighbors were waiting. They weren't just curious onlookers anymore, they were warriors. The moment I stepped down the courthouse stairs, a cheer erupted. Emma walked beside me, laptop in hand, looking as fierce as ever. We're making progress, Alex. The HOA's stranglehold is breaking. Mrs. Patel, the elderly woman who had been fined for her garden, stepped forward, gripping my hand. Thank you, she whispered, her voice shaking. For all of us. For the first time, I realized what this fight had become. It wasn't just about me. It wasn't just about my house. It was about every person who had ever been silenced, every family that had been forced out, every elderly homeowner who had been manipulated into selling their home for pennies on the dollar. We're not done yet, I said, my voice steady. We've frozen their operations, but now it's time to hold them accountable. Emma grinned. Then let's go get the proof. The crowd rallied around us, energized in a way I hadn't seen before. The fear was gone. In its place was determination. Diane and her board had ruled with an iron fist for too long. They thought they were untouchable, that no one could stand up to them. They were wrong. Because now, we weren't just fighting back. We were taking our community back. The town hall was packed, standing room only. Neighbors who had never spoken to one another now stood shoulder to shoulder, united by a common enemy. The air buzzed with anger and anticipation, and the HOA board sat at the front, clearly unprepared for what was coming. Diane, ever the dictator, tapped the microphone and forced a smile. Let's keep this meeting orderly, she began, her voice saccharine sweet. We're here to address concerns, but I assure you, all HOA actions have been within legal bounds. That was my cue. I stood from my seat and walked to the front, feeling every set of eyes lock onto me. I reached into my bag and pulled out a stack of documents, violation notices, bank statements, emails from Valley Development, and proof of financial fraud. Then explain this, I said, letting the papers drop onto the table in front of her. The mic picked up the thud, making the silence that followed even louder. Diane's face paled, her fingers twitching toward the papers. I'm not sure what this is. This, I cut her off, my voice steady, is evidence. Of extortion, of fraud, of illegal property seizures. It's all right here. Murmurs swept through the room, whispers growing into outraged voices. Emma, sitting in the front row, stood next. And here's the best part. She turned on the projector and displayed a list of properties, homes that had been forcibly taken from residents, all transferred to Valley Development LLC. Look familiar? She asked, looking directly at Diane. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Homeowners shot out of their seats, anger boiling over. Diane tried to speak, but her voice was drowned by the sound of people demanding answers. This is illegal, someone shouted. You ruined lives, another neighbor roared. For the first time, Diane looked afraid. The power she had wielded so freely was crumbling right in front of her. I crossed my arms and leaned toward the microphone. This community isn't yours to control anymore, Diane. We're taking it back. And by the thunderous applause that followed, I knew the tide had officially turned. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with homeowners who had suffered under Diane's rule. Neighbors who had been fined into financial ruin, elders forced from their homes, families bullied into selling at a loss, all of them were here, waiting for justice. I sat beside Emma, my hand steady, my mind razor-sharp. We had worked for this moment, and now, it was here. Diane sat across the room, her expensive suit unable to mask her twitching fingers and tightened jaw. She had always been so smug, so untouchable. But now, she was just another defendant in an ironclad case. The prosecution laid it all bare. The defendant, Diane Wilcox, used her position as HOA president to extort residents, impose fraudulent fines, and manipulate property values for the financial benefit of Valley Development Group. Screens lit up with evidence, emails she thought she had deleted, bank transfers she had tried to hide, even recorded conversations where she outright admitted to her scheme. Diane's face drained of color. Then came the witness statements. Mr. Jenkins, the 80-year-old veteran she had threatened with foreclosure over a garden statue, stood proudly before the court. She tried to break me, he said, voice strong, but instead, she built an army. Margaret, the single mother whose home was nearly taken, held up her violation notices. Every one of these was a lie, she said, her voice cracking. And now, everyone knows it. Finally, I stepped forward. I looked Diane in the eye and said, you called the rules unquestionable. You said we had no power. But today, Diane, we make the rules. The judge slammed the gavel. In light of overwhelming evidence, this court finds the defendant guilty on all counts. The room erupted. Neighbors cheered, hugged, cried. Diane? She sat frozen, her world shattered. As she was led away in handcuffs, I leaned toward her and whispered, you built this community on fear. We're rebuilding it on justice. Outside the courthouse, sunlight hit my face. The war was over. And we had won. The courthouse steps were a buzzing hive of reporters, neighbors, and onlookers, all gathered for the final reckoning of the Pinecrest Gardens HOA scandal. The air was thick with anticipation, camera shutters clicking like a drumroll as I stepped forward. I had spent months fighting in the trenches, exposing lies, standing my ground against corrupt power, and now, standing before the sea of expectant faces, I realized the battle wasn't just about me, it was about all of us. I cleared my throat, my voice strong and unwavering. Today marks the end of an era of fear, I began, my words amplified by a dozen microphones. For too long, people in this community were bullied, extorted, and silenced by those who thought they were untouchable. But they forgot one thing, you don't push people into a corner and expect them to stay there. We fought back, and today, we proved that no one is above the law. A wave of applause rose from the crowd, but I wasn't done. This isn't just about Pinecrest Gardens. This is about every community that has been controlled by greedy developers, every homeowner threatened into selling, every family forced to live in fear of a corrupt HOA board. Let this be a message to every corrupt official, every corporate-backed bully: you are not invincible. We are watching. And we will fight. The crowd exploded into cheers, some chanting my name, others raising their fists in the air. But the best part? The look on Diane's face as she was escorted past the cameras in handcuffs, her empire in ruins. The once feared tyrant was now nothing more than a disgraced fraudster, her power stripped away, her influence shattered. Beside me, Emma squeezed my hand, her eyes shining with relief and triumph. "You did it," she whispered. I shook my head. "We did it." As I stepped down from the podium, I saw my neighbors hugging, shaking hands, standing taller than they had in years. Justice had been served, and the scars of the past were already beginning to heal. We weren't just survivors. We were victors. I stood at the back of the courtroom, my fists clenched as the judge prepared to deliver the final ruling. Every injustice, every sleepless night, every moment of fear led to this very moment. Diane sat at the defendant's table, her once perfectly styled blonde hair now frazzled, her blazer wrinkled, her hands gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. The woman who once wielded power like a weapon now sat before us, waiting to hear how much of her fraudulent empire would crumble today. The court finds the Pinecrest Gardens Homeowners Association and its board guilty of fraud, harassment, and illegal property coercion, the judge declared, his gavel striking down with finality. A wave of gasps and whispers spread across the room. Beside me, Emma clutched my arm, her nails digging into my sleeve, but I barely felt it. I was too busy watching Diane's horrified expression, the moment she realized it was over. But it wasn't just over, it was destroyed. In addition, all improperly acquired properties must be returned to their original owners or compensated at full market value, and all unjust HOA fines and liens are officially voided. The courtroom erupted, neighbors weeping with relief, others shaking hands, and some even cheering outright. Years of financial ruin, intimidation, and control were washed away in an instant. Diane shot up from her seat. "This is a mistake. I am the HOA president. I have rights." Her voice cracked, and for the first time since this all began, she looked small, powerless. The judge barely spared her a glance. "Mrs. Wilcox, you have no power here anymore." As she was led out in handcuffs, I turned to face the crowd, the very people who had once been afraid to even step outside if their grass was half an inch too high. Now, they stood tall, victorious, free. Emma grinned at me through tears. "We won." I exhaled, a slow, satisfied breath. Not just a win, vindication. The sun had barely risen when I pulled into Pinecrest Gardens one last time, not as a victim, not as a man trapped in a battle for survival, but as someone who had won. The neighborhood looked different now. Not in the way Diane and her corrupt board had envisioned with their luxury condos and corporate schemes, but in a way that actually mattered. As I stepped out of my car, I noticed something remarkable: people weren't hiding anymore. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down, afraid of stepping an inch out of line, now stood together, chatting at their mailboxes, smiling, laughing. The fear that had poisoned this place was gone. Emma walked beside me, her heels clicking confidently on the pavement. "They took down the "No Unauthorized Gathering" sign this morning," she said with a smirk. "Turns out, we're actually allowed to exist in our own neighborhood now." As we passed the community center, I saw a group of residents working together to repaint the building. Gone was the cold, HOA-approved beige, they were adding color, real personality. A new era had begun. "Alex." Mrs. Thompson, the elderly woman who had nearly lost her home, hurried toward me, holding out a plate of cookies. You have no idea how much you've changed our lives. I accepted the treat, warmth spreading through my chest. This was what justice looked like, not just court victories, not just tearing down corruption, but rebuilding, healing. Down the street, workers removed the ridiculous security cameras Diane had installed on every corner. Across the road, a father helped his son put up a basketball hoop, no longer afraid of a $500 fine. I let out a long breath, looking around at the place I had fought for. This was worth it. Every sleepless night, every battle, every moment of doubt, it was worth it. I turned to Emma, a small smile tugging at my lips. What do you say we celebrate? She grinned. Already ahead of you. The whole neighborhood's throwing a barbecue tonight. No HOA permission required. For the first time in years, Pinecrest Gardens finally felt like home. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over Pinecrest Gardens, but tonight, the light didn't fade into the shadows of fear and oppression. No, tonight, it shimmered off grill smoke and string lights, danced in the laughter of neighbors finally free, and filled the air with a sense of victory, hard-earned, undeniable. Long folding tables stretched down the main street, covered in dishes brought by every family. Barbecue ribs, homemade casseroles, fresh fruit, plates piled high with food made not just for eating, but for sharing. The scent of smoky brisket mingled with warm baked bread as children darted between the crowd, their joyful shrieks echoing off homes that no longer carried the weight of endless fines and fear. I stood near the makeshift stage, an old wooden deck someone had dragged over from a neighbor's yard, watching as Emma raised a glass of sweet tea to the crowd. To our neighborhood, she called, her voice strong, clear, victorious. To justice, to community, and to never letting anyone take our homes from us again. A roar of cheers erupted, voices of all ages joining in. Old and young, longtime residents and new families, all standing together. As I glanced around, I saw faces once filled with worry and defeat now glowing with something different, pride. The fear was gone, replaced with a bond stronger than any corrupt HOA rulebook could ever enforce. For the first time, Pinecrest Gardens wasn't just a place to live. It was a home. Emma nudged me. So, what's next? I grinned, watching as neighbors danced beneath the lights, as laughter filled the air. Whatever we want, I said. Because this is our community now.